So today I just want to talk a little bit on these topics, a little bit of background, what swimmability might mean, what has been the cause of the swimmability decline in rivers in New Zealand, what's happening to fix it, and more importantly, will it work? So the genesis really and even why we're here tonight, really comes from the government's initiative called the New Start for Freshwater reforms. And one of the key elements of the reforms has been the development of a national policy statement on freshwater management. This document has been absent for the last 20 years, and it's long overdue, and it's needed to help guide regional councils, particularly in discharging their duties under the RMA. The absence has really created a policy and regulatory vacuum in which regional councils have struggled with dealing with the inordinate complexity of resource consenting and managing our waterways, and we can see the end result of that at the moment. Initially, when the NPS was developed, it had a weightable secondary contact bottom line to protect the compulsory value of human health. And this would mean if you got splashed by water, chances are you wouldn't die. But there was a public outcry about that, so the government introduced this notion of swimmability, and with the boundaries that the previous two speakers have so eloquently spoken about. Now I just want you to keep in the back of your mind, will this actually work? What I wanted to do next was just touch on some elements of what are swimmable rivers to perhaps some of us. They're different things to different people. One way you could perhaps capture it is that they're rivers that are safe and enjoyable to swim in, carry out recreation in, and able to be used. And the able to be used is actually quite important, because if you have toxic cyanobacteria blooms in, the rivers aren't actually able to be used. You don't want to get sick on them, you don't want them to look or smell funny or unhealthy or musty, as they do when you have a cyanobacteria bloom. You want clear water if possible, so that you can see, but of course some waterways are never clear. They have natural turbidity in them. You don't want to see unsightly algal growth, which will go between your toes or cause you not to be able to see the bottom clearly and then trip over in rocks. You don't want to see any signs which say not swimmable or unswimmable. Personally, I think it's a really good idea. The question is, can we achieve it? Another way of looking at it, we might even want to extend it a bit further and say, should we actually be aiming for drinkable rivers? Because years ago when I first started kayaking, most rivers we just drank from because they were clean enough and there wasn't any real health risk. So, what makes rivers swimmable? We've heard some good definitions of this and some really good presentations on issues around this. Clearly you need a suitable water volume, so if you don't have water, you don't have the resource. It needs to be deep enough, that's related to flow. You might want to have swimming holes, you might want a river reach that you can use, you might want to have a sloping bed, you might want to have rocks in the bed so that you can duck in behind eddies, in behind rocks and moving water. You might want it to be warm enough but not too warm. For a hot summer's day, you might want to have not too high a velocity so you don't get skittled off your feet. You probably don't want to have pollutants and pathogens and excessive algal growth or didymo growth, or you definitely don't need toxic cyanobacteria, because if that's there and there's a health warning notice out about it, you shouldn't be there and you can't actually use it. So why are this notion of swimmable rivers important to us? Well, we've already heard tonight that it really is a reflection on us as a community, a country, and our place in the world in a funny sort of way. It reflects the health of our fresh waterway ecosystems, our people and our country. Of course, one reason lots of tourists come to New Zealand is because of our pretty much untouched environment in many areas. But it's not just tourists that use our waterways, it's a public amenity as well. And it's not just for swimming. However, if we do actually sort things and have rivers swimmable, then a whole lot of other recreational activities, as I've listed there: fishing, picnicking, sightseeing, pack rafting, kayaking, canoeing, river bugging, stand-up paddleboarding, river surfing, pack floating, jet boating, tubing, food gathering, bird and nature watching, etc. will all be looked after, because we will have what would amount to be a reasonably healthy environment. What does the Swimmable River look like? Well, this is a shot of the Upper Norarora River in Hawke's Bay, and it shows a river with beautifully clear water in it, clear vision through to the cobbles on the bottom, so it's probably quite easy to go swimming there and probably quite pleasant. And the water is actually in that area probably more than drinkable. Certainly there's no dairy cattle or anything like that in the headwaters of that catchment, not yet anyhow, and hopefully it'll stay that way. So what's happened? Well, many streams and rivers have been swimmable in the past, including on our lowland areas. The water has been clear, drinkable, and with visible cobble beds without unsightly algal proliferation. It's been in an excellent condition for water-based activities. But what has historically happened in New Zealand is that there have been some badly polluted areas, particularly from industrial point source discharges such as freezing works waste or municipal sewage waste, and often lower in the catchments, but not always. What's the situation now? Many of our rivers are seriously polluted, and streams also throughout the country. There are often depleted flows and algal blooms, and this is especially the case in lowland streams and rivers. Their demise has been progressive, but entirely predictable and known for years. Parliamentary Commissioners for the Environment and organisations like Fish and Game have been expressing concerns over the issue for years and providing warnings about this. So what is the cause of the decline? It's primarily through increased diffuse discharges from changes in farming type, for example dairy, but it could equally come from intensive cattle farming and also other sources as well, and increased farm intensification, such as more use of fertiliser, higher stocking rates. In some cases, farming practices that are perhaps less desirable on certain soil types have been tried. Many point source discharges are now stopped, such as in the lower Waimakariri, but some businesses in New Zealand still discharge effluent into rivers, such as Silver Fern Farms down in the lower Clutha. Now, I've just got a question. Are regulations and plans sufficient to control diffuse discharges and reverse declines? And you'll hear more about this and much of the activity which has been happening in this area from Melissa, and you've also already heard some of this from John. I just want to give you some personal examples of experiences I've had where I've been confronted by issues on the Maruia River, which has a water conservation order on it. There's a lot of dairy farming now in the headwaters, land cleared all the way to the edge of the river. I went fishing there one day when I was up in the area having dropped some friends off to do a boating trip on the river, and the river was brown. Now that's not necessarily unusual, but it was in the circumstances I was there. I was there after heavy rain, but well after the fresh had gone through and where the river was basically returning to a normal water flow. The river stank and it was brown. The Huranui River is a river that I learnt to kayak on years ago, and it now has toxic bacterial blooms in the lower gorge where there were none before. But it's changed. Dairying is now well established on the Muri Plains upstream, and an elegant study has been done by Niwa which clearly shows that as you traverse the Muri Plains from the Mandamus down to this area, there is a consistent change in the presence of Phamidium, which is, we've heard, is a naturally occurring organism, from being only present in a very small concentration in the area at the top of the plains, down to below the plains where it virtually dominates and is almost 100% of the taxa on the riverbed. In the Ashley River, I went fishing on the opening day of a fishing season above the Akuka River confluence about 6 or 8 years ago with a friend, And I could not believe the river. It was green, but it was just green from a smothering of periphyton. Cobbles weren't really visible, and it was a mess. And the fish were really obvious to see, and they could see me, and it was hopeless trying to fish it. The Selwyn River at Coast Ford is another example which we've heard about and people know about. So if this is all so predictable, what's happening? What's happened? Well, I think to a certain extent the farming industry is not openly acknowledging the impacts of their intensification activities. We constantly hear complaints from farmers at times about, no, it's other causes, it's not us, etc. But the reality is, in the country areas where these rivers are being impacted on, it certainly as sure as hell isn't from people in Christchurch. Regional councils have been facilitating further irrigation development in some regions, and presumably indirectly that might lead to land or farm use changes and load releases, and therefore impacting on things in the future even worse. Perhaps the government is bowing to industry lobbying and political agendas. And one thing I will say is that the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment is concerned already that the NPS which we now have in place actually can be looked at in one way, and that is that it actually legitimises the parlous state of our waterways. And so the question must be, well, will it fix it? So the NPS and National Objectives Framework, which is known as the NOF and is part of the NPS, has set up a protocol for setting limits and bans for key parameters for water quality, which are to be populated for freshwater management units by regional council people working in conjunction with communities in a community-based led decision-making process under the guidance of the regional councils, or with the assistance of the regional councils. And one of the questions I have is, well, will they work? Well, given the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment's concerns, I must admit I have some doubts. There's some ambiguity in these NPS standards. Some of the standards are compulsory and others are left for the local community to decide. There are concerns that have been expressed quite widely about the fact that some of the bottom line standards fall far below what is required to guarantee a healthy river. And this is really, I think, where the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment was coming from when she said she was concerned that all this setting of these regulations was potentially going to lead to just legitimising the situation. Of course, communities can choose to actually have river conditions different to those that exist in the rivers, but whether that would actually happen in practice, I guess, remains to be seen. Another thing with the data which is being required to be collected by regional councils under this mechanism is that there will be a huge amount of data, and the issues are very complex. I'm the first to admit that. But my question is, well, how will all this be assessed and made sense of? From my own perspective, I've been involved trying to lobby for better recognition of recreation values within this process in some collaborative community consultative processes. And I have to say I've got a bit of a jaundiced view of them, and I've just given some examples here. It's really difficult for non-paid voluntary community interest groups, for a person like myself to be involved in these processes. There are something like 180 meetings a year in Canterbury alone, and more in fact. It requires time and money to be able to do this. Many other industry groups, of course, have people that they can pay to attend some of these things. So just because of that difficulty of involvement of voluntary community interests, you automatically end up with virtually exclusion of local, regional or national interest group values, such as recreation, from these local community processes. You can also run the risk of capture of water community processes by local farming interests and local community power bases, because if all of this is devolved just to the local communities, as I say in my next bullet point, it's difficult for wider community interests to be appropriately represented at two levels. One is that if you have farmers or people in a farming community who want to see really good, healthy environments, but there are other people within that community who are more interested in irrigation development or things which may not lead necessarily to those good solutions. Those people will find it difficult to remain and live in those communities. Also, outsiders like ourselves who come from Christchurch to paddle in other areas like the Huranui or places like that, outsiders normally aren't welcome when they want to try and have a say about how resources in their local areas might be used. So there's a difficulty of local communities also, I feel, in being able to make sense of much of the technical detail and huge time and resource commitment to make decisions that are suitable for them and the New Zealand public. So really, I just wanted to cut to the chase in terms of perhaps what the problem is. It's perhaps summarised here. This may change. The government has got a drive to double its economic development and farming outputs via increasing the farming it already does. And although I've been cheeky and said here without environmental constraints, but even if we do have some, if you double your inputs, presumably you're going to double your outputs unless some other things change which control those outputs or reduce them enough. But for me, especially if it's business as usual, that means more pollution in our environment and less swimmable rivers. And if that involves the taking of more water from surface water or hydraulically connected groundwater for farming, means possibly less water, and so again possibly less swimmable rivers. So what could we do? When I made this presentation to my fellow speakers, I did say I hope they wouldn't shoot me, but long story short, some of the suggestions I've made here, Melissa and Tim were quite happy to say to me, well, we're actually doing these things. So in Canterbury, ECAN has taken the bull by the horns and is trying a new approach to controlling farming impacts by not doing things at the front end, but by restricting outputs at the back end. And some of the reasons for this are forward-thinking, I think. They want to make sure that they don't have any unpleasant surprises, and they're also responding to what's been tried overseas, where things have been tried at the front end and haven't necessarily been found to provide the solutions. So a couple of things here, for example, halting or limiting further business as usual dairy farming or high-intensity releasing farming expansion. That's part of the Canterbury Land and Water Management Plan, although some of this is up for consideration in the courts at the moment. Requiring any new intensive farmers not to increase release of NMP into the environment is also part of that. Because simply, if we don't do things like this, matters will only continue to get worse. If inputs are going up and nothing is being done to change the outputs that are coming out, what's going to happen is pretty obvious. So requiring new dairy farmers to do something different is another option, but that has its own problems as well and is expensive, as you might imagine. Other things that could be done too would be to revisit the NPS, perhaps to fix up the concerns that the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment had. So parameters are set that do not legitimise the current parlous degraded state of a number of our waterways, but reflect really healthy environments and not degraded ones. A real tension to fix degraded environments. Some current bottom lines are for degraded environments in larger rivers. A focus on the environment and not on economic development. The latest changes to the NPS have economic development now indicated as a requirement. And this is a massive change which Sir Geoffrey Palmer's expressed some views on. The removal of permission to claim water quality has been maintained by keeping within an attribute band, which in my view is a licence to degrade. Other things could be also to regulate so farmers no longer have a social licence to pollute, or controlling new farming so that it makes things better or matters better, and requiring all current farming practices to make significant improvements with time. Because if we don't, and we just leave things as they are, or things stay as they are, simply because our inputs all go up, our farming all expands, and the things that we introduce to try and fix these problems don't fix the problems, we're still left having this conversation because nothing has really changed, because the inputs are affecting everything from what's been discussed before. Another thing that I'd quite like to see is our community recreation resources identified and the values around them put into plans, and in particular that rules in those plans are included to preserve and protect them as needed. And some of those rules might include retention of flows, retention of bed features, suitable water quality standards, so that we do have swimmable rivers, so that we can continue to paddle on our rivers. And one thing I think we're going to have to do, all of us, is we've got to be vigilant around just where this is all going, because it's part of an experiment to try and improve these things. But I have to say, from my analysis of things, and clearly other people's, when the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment expresses a view on things, obviously the view of others. So, some of you might have wondered what river bugging was. This is just a photograph of somebody on a wee drop in, I think, Maori Gully on the Huranui. Someone in a river bug. Thank you.